Everyone in our circle knows I've been infatuated with Victoria since we were kids. As her most dedicated admirer, I always cater to her preferences immediately. She likes black, so I gift her black stockings. She fancies learning niche languages, so I give her French polka dot socks. She enjoys flower arranging, so I present her with floral patterned tights. Despite my heartfelt efforts, she ran away on our wedding day to rescue her old flame abroad. 20 years of being childhood sweethearts turned into the biggest joke. I stood there wearing a suit worth millions of dollars and carrying stockings worth tens of millions, bearing all the shame alone, and completed the grand wedding by myself. While everyone waited to laugh at me, I laughed the loudest. What a foolish woman. There are plenty of women in the world. I can still dress someone else in those stockings. But there's only one business empire. I didn't just want her body, I wanted her money too. As Victoria's plane took off, I locked myself in the lounge, forcing out a tear. My irate father was cursing outside, while Mr. Victoria made call after call, trying to get her back. There were 2 messages on my phone. One from Victoria saying, "Sincere, wait for me. I will give you an explanation when I return." The other was a photo of Victoria heading towards the boarding gate, anxiously making a call. She was wearing the fishtail dress which I had worked tirelessly with the designer on, and the carefully chosen jewelry crown hung loosely in her hair. Her soft eyes and loving gaze seemed to be whispering sweet nothings to whoever was on the other end of the line. Anyone who saw it would sigh and say how lucky the man she loves must be. I zoomed in on the photo and stared at it for a long time. It was hard to let go, but I had given her the chance and she made her choice. She should have no regrets. I washed my face, straightened my suit, and walked out of the lounge with my head held high, smiling at the varied expressions of the elders outside. I declared, "The wedding will proceed as planned." Victoria returned 3 days later. During those 72 hours, I became the undeniable topic of the media. Newspapers, tabloids, and social media alike were abuzz with discussions about how Sincere, the eldest son of the Sincere family, was abandoned by his bride on their wedding day but still carried out all the elaborate wedding procedures alone. There were sighs about the coldness of wealthy families, some sympathizing with me, and naturally, some gloating. Regardless, the flood of articles had my name appearing before Victoria's for the first time. To express his apologies to the Sincere family, Mr. Victoria personally hosted a banquet to make amends. As we clinked glasses and toasted, Mr. Victoria said, "Sincere, this toast is from your father-in-law. You have my admiration. You truly are old Sincere's son. Thank you for making a decisive decision, safeguarding the reputation of our families. It's Victoria's fault. Rest assured I will ensure you receive an explanation." I humbly raised my glass. Just as I was about to speak, the banquet hall doors swung open, and a disheveled Victoria walked in. Seeing her, my father's face turned dark, and he slammed his glass down. The large banquet hall fell silent. Mr. Victoria glanced at my father, gritted his teeth, and shouted at Victoria, "Kneel." Victoria walked step by step to my father, lowered her head, and softly said, "Dad, I was wrong this time." My father snorted but didn't respond. However, the next moment, Victoria placed a document on the table, proudly raising her chin, saying, "But I also brought back the contract." Representing the Sincere family, I managed to sign a deal with the Bylan Group, a deal the Sincere family had been pursuing for half a year. All the details had been ironed out, but Bylan had hesitated to sign. The Sincere family had been racking their brains for a breakthrough, and my father had been stressing about it, his hair turning gray. Victoria had a knack for getting to the heart of the matter. Producing the contract was a massive achievement for the Sincere family. My father was momentarily taken aback, his face turning from angry to conflicted. Seeing this, Mr. Victoria, now relieved, led the applause and said, "Old Sincere, what do you think of my daughter now? She helped you secure Bylan, surely worthy of some commendation." People at the table started clapping after the initial awkwardness, and the atmosphere gradually warmed up. However, Victoria, having caused such embarrassment to my family, thought she could get away so easily? I frowned, walked to Victoria, scrutinizing her from head to toe, and said, "Victoria, why are you still wearing the dress from the wedding day? Has taking care of Mr. Ethan been too exhausting for you to change clothes, or is the wedding dress more convenient for you to care for him?" The banquet hall fell silent. Victoria's smile froze on her face. I forced a smile, wrapped my arm around her shoulder, and escorted her out, saying, "All right, you go home, take a bath, change clothes, and rest. Don't worry, I'm here." Behind me, I heard a heavy thump on the table. Without looking back, I knew it was my father. Mr. Sincere Sr.'s voice rang out, teeth clenched. "Stop, you're not going anywhere." As the tension mounted, a thin figure burst through the door, positioning himself between Victoria and me. He said, "Don't make things difficult for Victoria. It's my fault. It's all my fault." The one causing Victoria to run away was none other than her first love, Ethan. Ethan, trembling, bowed in apology and nearly fell over. With everyone watching, Victoria clung to him, helping him up and looking at him with a pained expression. "Didn't I ask you to wait in the car? Why did you come up? Are you feeling unwell?" she asked. Ethan's face was pale, his expression one of pain mixed with a bit of martyrdom. He said, "Victoria, don't argue with Mr. Victoria for my sake. It's not worth it. I won't live long anyway." "I can't leave you with a mess," Ethan managed to say before he started coughing violently. Victoria's eyebrows furrowed. Without saying a word, she struggled to support Ethan and started to walk out, not sparing a glance at anyone. "It's okay, Ethan. I'll take you to the hospital," she said. But the next moment, Mr. Victoria's stern voice echoed, "Victoria, stop right there." He was furious. "If you step out of this door, everything related to the Victoria family will no longer have anything to do with you." Victoria paused, turning to look coldly at her father. She bit her lip and said, "The biggest regret of my life is that I didn't stop you from sending Ethan abroad. Do you think you can still control me like back then?" Mr. Victoria's face turned ashen, but he couldn't utter a single word. My father shook his head and said, "Old Victoria, it seems you are no longer the master of your house." Victoria turned to my father and rolled her eyes. "Uncle, I didn't rush to the hospital with Ethan, but came to see you and Sincere. Isn't that enough?" "Some words are better left unsaid." Turning to me, her eyes were icy. "Sincere, I promised to marry you, and I did. I am Mrs. Sincere now. Maybe you feel proud, but you can never expect any feelings from me. You can never force that." After saying that, she held Ethan tighter and walked out without looking back. Ethan, leaning on her shoulder, turned back to look at me, a slight smirk forming on his lips. In full view, I crushed the wineglass in my hand, and blood dripped from my fingers onto the white tiles. Victoria and I had grown up together, with everyone assuming we'd marry. But when Ethan joined our class as a scholarship student in sophomore year, he quickly captured Victoria's heart. Despite Victoria's strong protests, Mr. Victoria sent Ethan abroad, and Victoria lost all contact with him. She became distant and quiet, agreeing to our arranged marriage only after losing all hope of reuniting with Ethan. When I asked her what she'd do if Ethan returned, she looked at me with dreamy eyes, saying, "Those days are past. I was so young I didn't understand love. Now I just want to be Mrs. Sincere." But just like that, everything changed. In my life, I've rarely lost control, so seeing me like this was probably harder for my father to bear than anything else. My mother quickly came to treat my wound while my father berated Mr. Victoria and then left with me, making sure to take the contract with Bylan. Victoria never looked for me. Instead, I heard about her and Ethan through my sources. Ethan had cancer and refused hospitalization, stubbornly demanding to stay in our marital home. Victoria didn't refuse him. My friend Charlie angrily scolded me, "Sincere, aren't you mad? You're being cheated on and you don't care?" I smiled and stopped my work, placing my hand over my heart. A bit sad, but not much. With the Bylan contract reaching its first payment milestone, money is far more important than women, brother. Charlie spat in my face. "You're ridiculous, Sincere. Your families are powerful enough to make everyone tremble, and you're saying you care more about money? Seeing his frustration, I reassured him, "Don't worry, this isn't over. Ethan will come to me soon." Sure enough, unable to stand my non-reaction, Ethan sought me out, meeting at a cafe near the Sincere Tower. I sized him up and said, "Ethan, you look good. My wife is taking good care of you." Ethan showed me the family heirloom ring. "Sincere, this is the ring entrusted to you by the Victoria family at your engagement. You've guarded it preciously, but now I'm toying with it. You think you have Victoria only because of your background, but I have everything you lack except your wealth." I found his arrogance amusing. "Ethan, congratulations on your dream come true, but do you know who revealed our wedding news to you, and why?" I leaned back, smiling. Ethan was stunned, eyes widening in disbelief. "No way it was you, right? Are you insane?" Leaning back, I continued smiling. Ethan's eyes flickered with panic. "What is your goal, Sincere?" I laughed. "Do you still need to ask?" "To protect my family and my wife. I pursued Victoria for over 20 years. How could I just let you have her?" "You need to work harder, Ethan." Ethan, seething with anger, asked, "What is your real goal, Sincere?" I chuckled at the question. "Isn't it obvious? To protect my family, my most beloved wife. I've pursued Victoria for over 20 years. How could I just hand her over to you? You still need to work harder, Ethan." Ethan was furious. He grabbed the coffee cup on the table and looked ready to throw it at me. I calmly pulled out a document and placed it in front of him. Seeing the contents, Ethan's face turned pale. He stammered, "How? How did you get this?" I smiled, putting on my coat and standing up. "Ethan, I'm never letting you two go. Let's see who prevails." A few days later, I was invited to the 20th birthday party of young Master James, the youngest son of the James family. The moment I walked in, I witnessed James landing a punch on Ethan's face, making it visibly swell. James was furious, grabbing Ethan by the collar and throwing him to the ground. "Victoria, why did you bring this disgrace to my party?" James demanded angrily. Ethan, getting up from the ground, defiantly pushed James aside. "Stay away from my woman. As a man, I know your intentions." James, exasperated, said, "Are you crazy? I was just toasting everyone." Ignoring James, Ethan turned to Victoria, sorrowfully saying, "Victoria, I understand now. I've failed you and caused you trouble. I don't have a prestigious background or the time to build a career like James. I deserve everything I'm going through." Victoria, distressed, threw herself into Ethan's arms. "You're my safe haven forever, Ethan." With a tender look, Ethan said, "Really? I'd love to be like James, acting in movies, winning awards, driving luxury cars, and living in mansions. Will you support me, Victoria?" Without hesitation, Victoria made a call, arranging for Ethan to be signed to a film company. From afar, I watched the absurdity unfold, finding it laughable. People inevitably get trapped by what they couldn't have in their youth. That once proud swan, Victoria, was being pulled off her pedestal by Ethan. Victoria gradually became a joke in social circles, and so did I, her fool of a husband. Ethan occupied her every moment. She wouldn't attend an event without him, isolating herself from other men in the circle after his jealous outbursts. The next time I saw Victoria was at a joint press conference, as the heads of our families combined business to sign a major government project. With the elders retiring, Victoria and I were the natural representatives. When I noticed Ethan wasn't by her side, I asked, "Is Mr. Ethan not accompanying you today, Victoria?" A flicker of emotion crossed her face before she replied, "He's on set filming," months after she told me not to expect her feelings. Victoria finally smiled at me. "Today's event is significant. I should be here with my husband." I stepped back, maintaining a polite distance. "Miss Victoria, in such settings, you should call me Mr. Sincere." Victoria's smile froze, and she struggled to speak. "Sincere." At that moment, the host invited the guests inside. Ignoring the unreadable look in Victoria's eyes, I nodded and entered the venue. The press conference was live-streamed. Midway through, I asked her, "Victoria, does Mr. Ethan know we're here together?" The host's voice was loud, so Victoria turned slightly to hear me. Just then, her phone began vibrating non-stop. She hesitated, but eventually hung up. For 5 minutes, her phone vibrated incessantly, displaying Ethan's name. I smiled at Victoria. Your relationship is truly enviable. Pressing her lips together, Victoria remained silent. During the company statements, I stood up, feeling a numbness in my leg. I stumbled, and Victoria instinctively stood to support me. Thank you, Miss Victoria, I said, patting her hand before starting my speech. As I began, staff rushed in, whispering to the host. Moments later, a live feed of Ethan standing on a rooftop appeared on the screen. Ethan shouted, "Victoria, why aren't you answering my calls? Why did you go to see Sincere? He was smiling at you. What did you say to him? Why? Why do you always force me to use such extreme measures to see you?" The camera zoomed in on Victoria. She stood up, staring at the screen, and responded, "Ethan, I didn't say anything. I had to be here today. Don't do anything rash. Please come down." Ethan's face contorted with rage and sorrow. "I don't believe you. You're the heiress of the Victoria family. Who could force you to do anything you didn't want to do? You wanted to see Sincere, didn't you? Since your marriage, you've been with me constantly. Now, you miss him, right? You reached out to support him, let him touch your hand. Have you no shame?" Victoria, feeling wronged, pleaded, "Ethan, I didn't. Please come down. I'll come back to you now, okay?" Ethan's voice cracked with anguish. "No, unless you prove it to me. Yes, go slap Sincere. Do it, and I'll believe you haven't cheated." Victoria looked at the city leader beside her, who was already furious, not sparing her a glance. She finally broke down and screamed, "Ethan, stop this madness." That seemed to push Ethan over the edge. He ran off the rooftop and into his car, driving it recklessly towards a crowd. There were many extras on set, and not everyone could dodge in time. We watched in horror as people were knocked down on the screen. Ethan didn't stop, driving away at high speed. When we arrived at the scene, paramedics and police were already there. The area was chaotic, with injured people lying everywhere and bloodstains all over. I immediately ordered the staff to open all RV doors and help the lightly injured inside to rest. Amid the commotion, I heard Victoria's phone ring. Ethan's frantic voice came through. "Victoria, save me. My car hit a tree. I'm stuck and bleeding a lot. I want to see you." Turning around, I saw Victoria busy helping the injured, having put her phone on speaker. Hearing Ethan's words, she stood up and anxiously asked, "Ethan, where are you? I'll come to you now." She started walking out. I sighed and called after her, "Victoria, you can't leave. This incident is too serious. If the film company's response is inadequate, it will severely damage Victoria Group's reputation. You must stay and handle the aftermath." Ethan must have heard me because he started to wail, "Victoria, I'm dying. I love you. If I die, please forget me." Victoria's eyes filled with pain and indecision. After a moment, she tightly grasped my sleeve, tears streaming down her face. "Sincere, please handle this. Ethan is in the late stages of cancer. He doesn't have much time left. I owe you, and I'll repay you." Without waiting for my response, she turned to leave. I laughed. "Victoria, do you know my nickname, Shaman? Do you know what it means?" She paused briefly but didn't respond, continuing to walk away. I sighed and muttered to myself, "Shaman signifies the harvest season is coming." This mass incident had a terrible impact. Victoria's act of deserting her duty was caught on camera and spread online, putting Victoria Group in even more dire straits amidst public scrutiny. I worked tirelessly for 48 hours, managing the crisis as Victoria's husband and the representative of both families, reassuring the injured and proposing a compensation plan. Exhausted, I walked out of the Victoria Group building, only to be startled by Victoria waiting at the entrance. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face streaked with tears, looking utterly broken. She choked out, "Sincere." Her voice was so hoarse I could barely hear her. "Sincere, Ethan was arrested. My father had a heart attack and is still in the ICU. Looking up at the sky, the dawn was breaking, painting the horizon with hues of light. I smiled and said, "Victoria, look, the sun is rising." Mr. Victoria finally woke up, and Victoria and I rushed to the hospital. His hair had turned half white. Seeing Victoria, he closed his eyes in disappointment and turned his head away. Mrs. Victoria's eyes were swollen from crying. She grabbed my hand, tears streaming down her face. Before Victoria could speak, her phone rang again. After hesitating, she answered on speaker. A voice said, "Hello, is this Miss Victoria? Mr. Ethan is in our custody. He insisted on seeing you, but we refused. He then bit his tongue, attempting suicide. Luckily, we found him in time. He only has minor injuries." Before the caller could finish, Victoria was already running out the door. Mrs. Victoria called after her, "Victoria, come back!" She broke down, crying loudly. Victoria hesitated but still left without looking back. Mr. Victoria closed his eyes in pain, a tear slipping down his cheek. The atmosphere was unbearably awkward. As I contemplated leaving, Mr. Victoria's assistant, Chris, rushed in out of breath. "Mr. Victoria, we have a problem," he said, panting. I instinctively grabbed his arm. "Chris, what's going on? Take your time." Catching his breath, Chris glanced at the lifeless Mr. Victoria on the bed, hesitating. Mr. Victoria motioned for him to speak. Chris carefully explained, "We've just received notice from the city government. They are very dissatisfied with Ms. Victoria's handling of the incident. They are demanding that Victoria Group withdraw from the project or replace the general manager before reconsidering," Chris said, visibly shaken. Mrs. Victoria stood up abruptly, panicking. Mr. Victoria, lying on the bed, started gasping for air. The blood pressure monitor next to him began beeping frantically. I quickly pressed the service button for help. Before the nurse arrived, Mr. Victoria lost consciousness. Mr. Victoria had a stroke, but he was saved in time. However, he was left paralyzed on one side of his body, doomed to spend the rest of his life in bed. Victoria rushed back from the detention center to receive the news that the board had decided to replace her as the general manager. The new appointee was me. Victoria stood outside her father's hospital room for days, but he refused to see her. One late night, exhausted from work, I decided to sleep in my office. As I turned off the lights, my phone buzzed. It was Victoria. After a moment of hesitation, I answered. "Victoria," I said. Silence on the other end. "Victoria," I called again. Her voice, soft and clouded with tears, came through. "Sincere?" I brought back the ring. "It's back in its original place. Why haven't you come to get it?" Fearing to provoke her further, I carefully replied, "Victoria, you know I never use things that others have used." She was silent for a long time before letting out a self-deprecating laugh. "That includes people, right?" I didn't know how to respond, so I just hummed in agreement. Deep into the night, she seemed to find solace in speaking, alternating between laughter and tears. "Sincere, Ethan lied to me. He never had cancer. He faked it to gain my sympathy. No wonder he refused to go to the hospital, insisting on staying home. It was during his detention center physical that I found out he was never sick." Her voice broke. "Sincere, I regret everything. I hated my father for over a decade because of Ethan. I missed our wedding, hurt you for someone who lied to me. Only now do I realize you were the only one who always genuinely cared for me." I quietly listened as the night breeze gently blew in, bringing back memories. The night Ethan was sent abroad by Mr. Victoria. Victoria vented her anger on me, throwing tantrums. Worried, I always picked her up after her late-night parties. One night, as I stood outside a club, I overheard her friend saying, "Victoria, Sincere is always looking for you. Isn't it time to let him go?" Victoria replied, "If it weren't for our arranged marriage, Ethan wouldn't have suffered. I'll marry him, ruin his family, and make him the world's biggest joke." Pulled from my memories by her quiet sobs on the other end, I softly chuckled. "Victoria, Sincere has moved on. On a bright afternoon, I visited Ethan in detention with James. The physical and mental torment had taken a toll on him. He looked like a candle about to be snuffed out by a storm. Through the bulletproof glass, Ethan glared at me with venom in his eyes. "Sincere, are you here to gloat?" he spat. I laughed softly. "Ethan, do you still think I see you as an opponent? You were just a pawn." I showed him the photo of Victoria at the boarding gate. I could have stopped her from boarding. That was her final chance. Ethan, finally realizing the truth, asked, "You leaked your wedding news to me, lured me back to be the villain?" Slamming his fists against the glass, he screamed, "You maniac! You claim to love Victoria, yet you did all this. What's your real goal?" Seeing his rage, I explained calmly, "Victoria was my father's last move. She sabotaged our efforts with Bylan. Marrying you meant she couldn't act against us." Ethan, restrained by guards, kept shouting, "I'll tell her everything." As I walked away, James asked, "How did you know they would fall for your traps?" I replied, "People can't escape their desires." Victoria was always ensnared by Ethan, and he clung to her like a lifeline. Victoria had always led a charmed life. Ethan was her only setback, and he ensnared her like an anchor, dragging them both into the abyss. James and I fell silent, recognizing we too were just as ensnared by our own desires. With the support of both families, I took over Victoria Group, ensuring a smooth transition. The combined workload of both empires was overwhelming. After thorough evaluation and board approval, Victoria Group and Sincere Group officially merged, becoming an unshakable behemoth under my leadership. The company thrived, but Victoria lost all her luster. She spent her days cooped up in our marital home, experimenting with recipes I might like, asking if I'd come home for dinner. I never once returned to that so-called home. Life passed uneventfully until Ethan was released from prison, bringing the final blow. Victoria and Ethan stormed into my office, her eyes red and desperate. She stood trembling before me, reaching out with quivering hands. "Sincere, tell me Ethan is lying." Ethan stood smugly beside her, head held high. Under her hopeful gaze, I nodded. Everything he said is true, assuming he didn't exaggerate. Victoria took 2 steps back, pushing Ethan away when he tried to hold her. With empty eyes, she asked, "Sincere, was everything a lie? The years we spent together, you doing everything I liked, protecting me, was it all fake? You seemed genuinely happy to marry me. Was it all a lie? Why? You were the only one who treated me well. Why did you have to do this to me?" Ignoring her barrage of questions, I took out a document from the cabinet behind me and placed it before her. "Victoria, let's be honest. The Sincere family couldn't secure the Bylan contract, finding no breakthrough. The Bylan CEO is your friend from college. You traded another deal with her to delay our contract indefinitely, aiming to cripple the Sincere family. Am I right?" Seeing Ethan's confusion, I added with a smile, "Thanks to Ethan, you rushed to see him upon hearing his illness, even if it meant missing our wedding. To placate my father, you had to present the Bylan contract. I know Ethan was your first love, but it was Mr. Victoria who separated you two, not the teenage Sincere who always protected you. Yet you projected your powerlessness onto me and the Sincere family. I once loved you wholeheartedly, but you manipulated me at every step. If you didn't love me, why marry me?" Victoria, tears streaming down her face, replied, "I needed the Sincere family's support. Well, I fulfilled your dream. The Sincere and Victoria families are now one under my leadership, and we are still married. So in a way, your dream has come true, right, Victoria?" After a long, painful silence, Victoria finally stood up without a word, walking towards the door. Hand on the doorknob, she turned back and said firmly, "Sincere, I will take back everything that belongs to me." In the following months, Victoria made numerous attempts to regain her power, but she failed each time. The combined entity of the two families rendered her efforts futile. After years of fruitless endeavors, Victoria's spirit finally broke, and she became a shadow of her former self. For my 25th birthday, Charlie and James threw a grand party, Inviting all the influential heirs and heiresses, I lounged on a sofa, letting them have their fun. Disapproving, Charlie brought over 10 models, insisting I choose one. Grinning, he whispered, "Pick 2 or 3 if you like." Scanning the lineup, I casually pointed at one, her. The young model, looking pure and innocent, knelt beside me, timidly calling me Mr. Sincere, her hands gently massaging my shoulders. The moment seemed to stretch until Victoria's voice cut through the air. "Sincere, don't forget I'm still your wife." The girl flinched, freezing in place. I patted her hands, motioning her to continue. Facing Victoria's furious gaze, I couldn't help but laugh. "Victoria, I promised to marry you and I did. You should be happy. But emotions, you shouldn't expect or force them." Laughter echoed around us as I closed my eyes, seeing a vision of the boy who once followed Victoria everywhere, finally smiling back at me.